It was just another day in Sugar Hill, sun-dappled streets, a soft breeze carrying the scent of the Hudson. But in this world, the air was never as clean as it seemed. Not when power walked by, and certainly not when you found yourself on the wrong side of it. And that's where it all started. One waiter, dressed in crisp white, too clean for a place like this. You could smell the nervousness on him even before he set foot inside. But none of the high society women sipping tea at the garden party could smell the blood in the air. They didn't know he wasn't from here. Hell, they didn't even notice the way his hands trembled. He was an outsider, a mechanic sent to make a payment disappear. He didn't know who he was dealing with. If he had, he might have run faster than any of us would have thought possible. But he didn't. He approached the Queen of Harlem, Mrs. Johnson, with a polite smile on his face. Too polite. There was something off about the way he moved, how his eyes kept darting to her, never meeting her gaze directly. But Mrs. Johnson, she didn't see it. She was too busy laughing, the way only someone who owned Harlem could, surrounded by women who looked at her like she was a goddess. She never noticed the waiter stumble slightly, the way his leg brushed against her, a small accident that looked natural enough. A napkin fell, a clumsy move that made the women giggle. But when he bent to pick it up, that's when everything changed. In the shadows, under the cover of linen and laughter, his hand slipped into his sleeve. It wasn't a pen he pulled out, it was something far darker, a device. A syringe carefully engineered for a job no one was supposed to notice. The toxin inside, digitalis, would make the heart stop, but the waiter didn't know what he'd triggered. He didn't know he wasn't just about to take out a woman, he was stepping into the kind of storm that only a king could weather. The needle hit her leg. Quick, precise. Quiet, just like it had been designed. For a moment, nothing. Then it hit her. Mrs. Johnson gasped. The glass she held dropped from her fingers, the silver spoon clinking as it hit the plate. A strange dizziness came over her, a sickening heat. She rubbed her leg instinctively, thinking it was just a bug bite, but it was. The waiter, his face a mask of concern, pulled himself back into the crowd. He disappeared before anyone noticed the first signs of something worse than a sting. And then Mrs. Johnson, she collapsed. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't some Hollywood feint. No, she hit the ground hard, the kind of fall that shakes everything around you. The noise of her body hitting the grass cut through the conversation like a gunshot. Screams erupted, the calm shattered, but no one knew what had really happened. Not yet. In the back room of a lounge in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sat across from a politician, the kind of man who thought he controlled everything because he had a title. Bumpy didn't need titles. He didn't need votes. He had something much better, control. The game was always his, but this wasn't part of the plan. And then the door swung open. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a crash that shattered the quiet. Bumpy's eyes snapped up, cold, calculating. Zip, his most trusted enforcer, stood there. But this time, Zip's face wasn't calm. There was something else in his eyes, something Bumpy knew meant only one thing. Something was wrong. "Bumpy," Zip said, and the tone of his voice stopped everything in its tracks. The kind of tone Bumpy had only heard a few times in his life. The kind that came before tragedy. Bumpy didn't need more. He could see it in Zip's face. His world was about to crack. "Tell me," Bumpy whispered, a quiet menace in his voice. "Your wife, she's gone down." "My wife is at the hospital, Bumpy. They say it's bad." It didn't make sense. The woman who was untouchable, the Queen of Harlem, the one who held the city's power in her soft hands. Bumpy Johnson's one true equal. She couldn't be taken down like this. Not by anyone, not now, not when things were this delicate. He stood up. The motion was quick, violent, his chair tipped over, a chessboard scattering. But his mind, sharp and calculating, already knew what had happened. The rest of the room faded as Bumpy moved. There was no room for doubt, no time to hesitate. His mind was already racing through the steps. "We're going to Harlem Hospital," he growled, and that was just the beginning. The game was on and Bumpy wasn't losing. Not now. Not when someone had dared to touch what was his. The door slammed behind him. It was time to move. Bumpy's Cadillac tore through the streets of Harlem, cutting through traffic like a knife through silk. The city that never stopped moved around him, but in his car, the world was still. His eyes were fixed forward, his jaw clenched tight, a man who had seen death and lived to see the aftermath. But this was different. This wasn't just about power anymore. It wasn't about territory or money. It was about something far more personal. They had touched his heart, and for that they would pay. The driver didn't dare speak, didn't dare ask questions. He just drove faster, harder, as if the very asphalt beneath them could feel the rage radiating off Bumpy. The streets were familiar. The smell of the city, the chaos, all of it was a backdrop to the single thought running through Bumpy's mind. Someone was going to pay. Harlem Hospital. The place was a fortress, walls thick with stories of pain and survival. But for Bumpy, this was nothing more than another battlefield. As the car screeched to a halt, he didn't wait for the driver to stop fully. The door flew open and Bumpy was out, moving with a speed that belied his age. His shoes slapped the concrete, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot. He didn't slow down, not even for the doorman who stumbled back at the sight of the man who ruled the streets. "Where is she?" Bumpy's voice rumbled low and steady as he passed the front desk, ignoring the receptionist's frantic calls for him to wait. "Third floor. ICU." He didn't need any more. The steps to the elevator felt like they took a lifetime. Bumpy didn't look back. His mind was already 5 steps ahead, calculating, plotting. There was no time to waste. He was about to walk into the eye of a storm, but the storm would never touch him, not when he saw it coming. The door to the ICU swung open. The lights were dim, the air thick with antiseptic. A nurse stepped in front of him, but Bumpy didn't break stride. He stopped only for a moment to make sure the woman saw the cold fury in his eyes. She didn't protest. She couldn't. The look alone was enough to make her step aside. Bumpy moved through the sterile halls like a ghost, all but invisible in his focus. He wasn't there to make noise. He wasn't there to demand anything. He was there for one thing and one thing only. Room 304. He stood in the doorway, his eyes immediately locking onto the figure lying in the bed. Mayme Johnson, his wife, the queen of Harlem. Her skin, usually a deep and vibrant shade, was now ghostly pale. The machines around her beeped rhythmically, but the sound was hollow. It was a cruel reminder that time was slipping away, that the world had taken something from him, but the rage bubbling inside him. It wasn't just grief, it was a cold, unshakable certainty. They had made a mistake. He stepped closer to the bed, every muscle in his body taut with an energy that could break anything in its path. He didn't need words. He didn't need explanations. He had been down this road before, too many times. His fingers brushed her hand, cold and limp in his grip, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "Baby, I'm here." The words were almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of a promise of retribution, a promise that no one would escape what was coming. He sat down beside her, the chair scraping against the floor, loud enough to break the silence that had surrounded her since the moment she fell. Every second felt like an eternity, each beat of the heart monitor echoing in his skull. And that's when he saw it. A tiny mark, small, insignificant to anyone else, but Bumpy wasn't anyone else. The moment his eyes locked onto that puncture wound on her leg, he knew. His stomach clenched, the air in the room grew colder. He stood up, his chair crashing to the floor as he leaned closer, studying it. He reached for her leg, his fingers brushing against the skin. He could feel it, the difference between a bug bite and something far more sinister. No one had seen it, not the doctors, not the nurses. No one had noticed the mark that screamed of a message that said, "She's not untouchable, she can be broken." But Bumpy wasn't the kind of man who broke. Not now, not ever. He moved toward the door. His mind was already racing, piecing the story together. He knew the enemy, he knew the game, and he knew exactly how it was going to end. Outside the room, Dr. Sterling stood, talking in hushed tones to a group of nurses. He looked up when Bumpy walked toward him, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. Bumpy didn't wait for the doctor to speak. He didn't need to. "Where's my wife?" Bumpy asked again, his voice colder than the morgue. Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but Bumpy cut him off. "Don't give me that medical garbage. She's been poisoned." The doctor's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was too late. And just like that, Bumpy knew. The game had shifted. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about war. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Dr. Sterling was still standing there, his posture stiff, his mouth agape as if he didn't quite know how to respond to the cold fury emanating from Bumpy. But Bumpy wasn't waiting for an answer. He had no patience for lies, for science, for anything that wasn't getting results right now. "Sterling," Bumpy said, his voice like ice scraping across metal. "You think I'm stupid. You think I don't know what happened here." Sterling's hands trembled as he tried to adjust his glasses, his face turning red as he stammered for a response. But Bumpy wasn't interested in explanations. Not today. "I want answers, and I want them now," Bumpy continued, his voice low but so intense that it felt like a threat wrapping itself around the doctor's neck. Dr. Sterling swallowed hard. "Mr. Johnson, I understand your concern, but it's—" "Save it," Bumpy interrupted. He was done with medical terms, done with the bureaucracy. "You're gonna tell me who did this to her, and you're gonna do it fast. Because if I find out you're covering something up, this hospital won't need a heart monitor to check its pulse." The doctor flinched, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. But still, he hesitated, clearly struggling to keep his composure. Bumpy stepped forward, his presence so overwhelming that the space seemed to shrink. "Bumpy, I swear I don't know anything about this," Sterling muttered, now desperately trying to backtrack. "We're doing everything we can, but—" "Everything you can isn't good enough." Bumpy's voice was like a blade, each word cutting through the air. "Your everything almost killed her." Sterling took a step back, his hands raised in a defensive gesture, but Bumpy wasn't buying it. He could see the fear in the doctor's eyes, now fear of him, and that was exactly what Bumpy wanted. He wasn't here to talk, he wasn't here to wait for anyone's permission. "I need a tox screen," Bumpy ordered. His gaze never left the doctor's face, a silent demand. "You're gonna run that test, right now. I don't care about your rules, I don't care about your procedures. You're gonna run it or I'll find someone who will." Sterling looked as if he were about to argue, but then the look in Bumpy's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. And it was the kind of statement you didn't question if you valued your life. He nodded quickly, his mouth tight. "Right away, Mr. Johnson," he said, finally defeated, before turning to the nearby nurse. "Get the kit. Draw blood." Bumpy didn't move from his spot, but his mind was already working, already piecing together the puzzle. Poison. It wasn't just a random attack, it was a message. And that message, it was aimed at him. He stood there in the sterile, cold hallway, his mind shifting gears faster than anyone could keep up with. The Italians, Vinnie Falcone, the rats who were creeping into his territory. He'd seen it before, but this time they made a mistake. They didn't just come for his territory. They came for his queen, and for that they would pay. The blood test came back faster than Bumpy had expected, too fast. The nurse was back in the room with the results almost as soon as she'd left. She didn't speak a word, just handed the sheet to Bumpy. His eyes scanned the paper, his brow furrowing as he saw what he'd already known. "Digitalis," Bumpy muttered to himself, the word rolling off his tongue like a death sentence. He looked up at Dr. Sterling, his expression dead. "You didn't think I'd catch that, did you? You thought I'd buy your heart attack story, thought I'd sit in the corner and cry." Sterling swallowed, his throat dry. He took a step back, his hands shaking as he struggled to find something to say. Bumpy's eyes never left him. "You know what happens now," Bumpy said, the calm before the storm. "You'll tell me who hired the boy. I want names, I want addresses, and I want this cleaned up. If you don't, I'm gonna be back, and next time it won't be the poison I'm bringing." Sterling's mouth opened and closed, but the words didn't come out. Bumpy could see the gears turning in the doctor's head. He knew the game was up, and Bumpy, he was already 2 steps ahead. With a single nod, Bumpy turned and left the room. His mind was focused on one thing, Vinnie Falcone. He had been too careless, too arrogant, and now he was going to pay. But first, there were things that needed to be handled. Bumpy's hands were steady as he strode through the hospital corridors, his mind already working the angles. His wife was still fighting against the poison that had been injected into her, fighting against the lie that had nearly stolen her life. But now, she wasn't the only one who had to fight. Vinnie Falcone and his crew were about to learn just how dangerous it was to make an enemy of Bumpy Johnson. The night air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, but it couldn't cool the heat building in his chest. Bumpy wasn't a man of rage, he was a man of control, but someone had crossed a line. And the moment someone did that, all bets were off. His mind raced. Vinnie Falcone was a snake, but this was more than just a simple territorial dispute. This was personal. The vulture thought he could take the throne by taking out Bumpy's queen. He didn't know it yet, but that was the worst mistake he could have made. No one took from Bumpy Johnson and lived to tell the tale. His Cadillac was waiting for him at the curb, the black car a constant in a world of change. Zip was already in the passenger seat, his face as hard as granite. He didn't need to ask what was coming. They both knew the rules had changed. Where we headed? Zip asked, his voice low, sharp. The Italians, Bumpy said, his gaze already fixed on the road ahead. Vinnie's time is up. They drove in silence, the city flying by them in a blur of neon lights and dark alleys. Harlem was alive at night, full of secrets, full of danger. But tonight the streets would bend to Bumpy's will. When they pulled up to the restaurant, it was just as Bumpy expected, busy, bustling, full of life, but all of it hiding something. Vinnie Falcone and his crew were inside, laughing, drinking, pretending like they owned the city. But they didn't. They never. Bumpy had always been the one pulling the strings. Bumpy stepped out of the car, his shoes clicking against the pavement with each step. Zip followed close behind. There was no need for words between them. Bumpy's presence was enough. The restaurant door swung open, and the moment Bumpy entered, everything went still. Conversation slowed. Glasses paused midair. Even the waiters hesitated. At the far corner, Vinnie Falcone sat with two of his men, a cigar dangling from his lips. He looked up, a tight smile on his face, but the moment he saw Bumpy, it faltered. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He was too arrogant to show fear, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Bumpy," Vinnie called out, spreading his arms wide. "What's this? A little late-night visit?" "What?" Bumpy didn't respond at first. He just walked toward the table, his movements slow and deliberate. The soldiers standing next to Vinnie reached for their guns, but Bumpy never took his eyes off of him. "Sit down," Bumpy said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Vinnie waved his men off. "It's okay, boys, Bumpy's just stopping by for a drink." Bumpy didn't sit. He didn't need to. He just stood over Vinnie, his shadow looming large over the man. "I'm not here for a drink. I'm here to return something." Vinnie raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to play it cool, but there was something in his eyes now, something that told Bumpy he was starting to realize this wasn't some casual visit. This was about to get very real. "Return something?" Vinnie asked, his voice forced. "What are you talking about?" Bumpy's hand moved into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a gun, he pulled out something much more dangerous, a napkin. He dropped it on the table in front of Vinnie. The small gesture was almost too casual, too clean. Vinnie frowned, confused. "A napkin? You came all the way down here to give me a napkin?" Bumpy's eyes never left him. "Look under it." Vinnie hesitated. He looked down at the napkin, his confusion growing. He lifted it, but as soon as he did, Bumpy moved, quick, silent, efficient. A syringe. A fountain pen-sized syringe, the same one that had been used on his wife. And it was in Vinnie's neck now. Vinnie gasped. His hand flew to his neck as he tried to stop the blood from rushing, but Bumpy had already made his move. The damage was done. Digitalis, the same poison that had nearly killed his wife, was now coursing through Vinnie's veins. "What the hell did you do?" Vinnie choked out, his face turning red. Bumpy stood back, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Poison, the same dose you gave her. The only difference is you're bigger. Maybe your heart can take it. Maybe it'll pop like a balloon, but either way you're out of time." Vinnie fell to his knees, gasping for air. His soldiers hesitated, not sure whether to pull their weapons or help their boss. But Bumpy was unfazed. His calmness, the certainty in his movements, it made him untouchable. "You have a choice," Bumpy said softly, his voice almost too calm. "You can call an ambulance. Maybe it'll work. Maybe you'll live. Or you can sit there, waiting for your heart to give out." The restaurant was dead silent, every eye in the room on Bumpy and Vinny. No one moved. No one breathed. They were all witnesses to a power shift in real time. Vinny's men rushed to him, lifting him up, shouting for a doctor, but it was too late. The poison had done its job. The room was already starting to smell like a death sentence. Bumpy didn't wait. He turned and walked out. His job was done. His message delivered. And as he stepped back into the cold night, Bumpy's thoughts were already on the next move. They'd come for his queen. Now they'd see what it meant to mess with Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's Cadillac moved through the night, slicing through the dark streets of Harlem like a blade through silk. The city was still alive, but Bumpy, he was already past the moment. His mind was sharp, calculating, and the weight of the night had yet to touch him. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts, they were a storm, spinning, moving, calculating every angle, every piece of the game. The Vinny Falcone problem was handled. He'd seen that coming. What came next, though, was the part Bumpy relished. The part where the pieces fell into place and the streets knew who the real king was. But there was something else now, something deeper. A name had come up, the waiter, Johnny Hooks, a kid, fresh-faced, green around the edges. He was the one who stuck the needle into Mrs. Johnson's leg. Bumpy could see his face, clear as day. The kind of kid who thought he was playing the game but didn't understand the rules. A mechanic just trying to clear a debt, but his mistake. It was the kind you couldn't come back from. Bumpy's car slid to a halt in front of the old, worn-down brownstone, the Bronx, a place that smelled like cheap cabbage and stale desperation. Bumpy had spent enough time here to know exactly what was inside. The walls, thick with secrets. And tonight it was no different. Zip opened the door, his eyes scanning the street, his hand resting casually near his holster. No one dared mess with Zip, not when Bumpy was in town. "Let's move," Bumpy growled, his voice low, cutting through the night like a warning. He didn't need to say more. Zip knew exactly what came next. They were here for Johnny Hooks. And they weren't leaving without him. They made their way up the stairs, their boots silent on the creaking wood. At the top, they stood outside room 4B, a dim light spilled from under the door, the soft sound of jazz faintly coming from inside. Bumpy's fingers tightened into fists. The kid didn't know who he'd messed with, but Bumpy was about to make him understand. Bumpy didn't knock, didn't wait. He twisted the handle and the door opened with a soft creak. Inside, Johnny was packing a suitcase, street clothes, jeans, a leather jacket. The kid looked up, startled, his face draining of color the moment he saw Bumpy. Johnny reached for something on the dresser, a gun. It was a cheap .22, the kind of weapon a kid who didn't know what he was doing would grab. But Zip was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides, backhanding the kid across the room. The force of it sent Johnny crashing into the wall, his head slamming into the plaster with a sickening thud. Zip grabbed the gun before Johnny could make a move, pocketing it. The kid didn't even try to fight back. He was already broken. Bumpy walked into the room, his footsteps deliberate, heavy. His eyes locked onto Johnny, who was now sprawled on the floor, blood trickling from his lip. The kid was young, too young for this kind of mess, but Bumpy wasn't in the business of mercy. Not when it came to his family. "You dropped a napkin," Bumpy said, his voice cold, casual as he looked down at Johnny. The kid didn't respond, his mouth open in a weak gasp, blood still trickling from his busted lip. "You dropped a napkin, and you stuck my wife with a needle." Johnny tried to speak, but the words didn't come. He just stared up at Bumpy, fear spreading across his face. He knew what was coming, he didn't need to ask. Bumpy kicked the kid in the ribs, not hard enough to kill, but enough to send a message. Johnny screamed and curled into a ball, trying to protect himself, but it wasn't enough. He wasn't going to escape this. "We checked the tox screen," Bumpy said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Digitalis, foxglove, clever." Johnny looked up, shaking his head, gasping for air. I don't know what you mean. I'm just a waiter." Bumpy wasn't having it. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He grabbed Johnny by the hair and pulled him up to his feet, slamming him back into the dresser. The cheap wood splintered under the force. "Who gave you the device?" Bumpy demanded, the kid's eyes filled with terror. He knew the answer would be his death sentence. I don't know his name. He just gave me the job, told me I had to do it or else." Bumpy's patience was gone. He grabbed a stapler from the desk, holding it up in front of the kid's face. The metal glinted in the dim light. Johnny's eyes widened as Bumpy pressed the sharp edge to his hand. "That's for being sloppy," Bumpy said as he drove the staple into the webbing between Johnny's thumb and forefinger. The kid screamed in pain, but Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't stop. Now Johnny was crying, shaking, his entire body trembling with fear and pain. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about the agony. He cared about one thing now, survival. He spilled everything. "I don't know his name. He said it was for Vinnie Falcone. He told me to do it. Vinnie said you were getting old, that taking out your wife would break you. I thought it was just a job. I didn't know who she was to you. I swear." Bumpy listened, his face a mask of stone. He didn't show emotion. He didn't need to. The rage was quiet now, a controlled burn, but it was burning all the same. Vinnie, the vulture. The pieces fell into place. Bumpy's eyes locked on Johnny's face, cold and calculating. This wasn't just about a hit anymore. This was about a war. Johnny faltered, gasping for air, trying to beg. "Please, I didn't know, please." Bumpy's voice was soft. "You don't get a pass for that, not when you touch the queen." He turned away from the kid, his focus now entirely on the next move. "Zip," Bumpy said, his voice steady. "Take him to the marsh." Johnny didn't get another word out. Zip hit him hard across the temple, knocking him out cold. He threw the kid over his shoulder like a sack of laundry and headed for the door. Bumpy didn't look back. He knew exactly what came next. The war had started. Bumpy's mind was already calculating, already a step ahead. The kid was taken care of, the message was sent. But now it was time to deal with the puppet master behind the scenes. Vinnie Falcone was the one who thought he could make a move on Bumpy Johnson's empire. He thought he could shake the throne, bring down the king. Bumpy was about to show him how wrong he was. The night was still young, but it felt like time had already run out for the vulture. The minutes ticked by like a countdown, and Bumpy didn't need to check the clock. He knew. The pieces were already moving, and Vinnie had made the mistake of stepping into Bumpy's world without understanding the rules. It was time to take the fight to him. Bumpy slid into the back of the Cadillac, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the window. Zip was already in the car, his face unreadable as usual. The two men didn't need words between them. They both knew the weight of what was coming next. Bumpy's mind was locked onto one thing only. Vinnie Falcone needed to pay for underestimating him. The streets of Harlem blurred past them as they drove toward the Italian restaurant where Vinnie had made his last stand. Vitali's, a red sauce joint that looked like it belonged in the old days. It was the kind of place where people came to eat pasta and make deals, but tonight, it would be the site of a bloodier deal than anyone could have anticipated. As they pulled up to the restaurant, Bumpy felt the tension in the air, thick like smoke. Inside, Vinnie was probably sitting there, thinking he was untouchable. But that was the problem. He didn't understand the game. The car came to a halt in front of Vitali's. Bumpy didn't even give Zip a nod. He stepped out first, moving with the same calm, lethal precision he always did. The restaurant's lights seemed dimmer as Bumpy walked up to the door. He didn't need to knock, didn't need to announce his presence. The door swung open and the temperature inside dropped. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation. It all stilled the moment Bumpy set foot in the room. Vinnie Falcone was at a corner table, surrounded by his soldiers. The man was loud, his neck thick with arrogance, his suit a size too tight. He looked like he owned the place, but Bumpy knew better. The moment Vinnie saw Bumpy, his smile faltered. The cocky bravado slipped away. There it was, the first crack in the facade. "Bumpy," Vinnie said, his voice still trying to play it off, but the tension was thick in his words. "I didn't know you were a fan of Italian food." Bumpy didn't smile, didn't crack a joke. His gaze was like steel, cutting through the bravado like it was nothing. "I'm not here for food," Bumpy said, his voice carrying like a low growl, the kind that made men like Vinny feel small. "I'm here for something you took." Vinny laughed, trying to hide the nervousness now creeping into his chest. "Come on, Bumpy, what's the problem? We're just two guys doing business." Bumpy's gaze never wavered. He walked closer, each step a command, each movement a reminder that Vinny was no longer in control of this situation. "You don't get it, do you, Vinny?" Bumpy said, his voice so calm it sent a chill down Vinny's spine. "You thought you could mess with my family. You thought you could put your hands on what's mine." Vinny stood up, his men following suit. They were reaching for their guns, trying to protect their boss, but Bumpy wasn't fazed. He'd seen this before. He knew how it played out. "I don't know what you're talking about, Bumpy," Vinny said, his voice strained now, his bravado crumbling. "We do business the same way, don't we?" Bumpy moved like lightning. His hand shot out, fast and deliberate, slamming a syringe into Vinny's neck with a precise, deadly strike. The fountain pen-like device slid into his skin with a click. Vinny gasped, his eyes wide with horror as he clutched at his neck. The room froze. Soldiers who had just reached for their weapons hesitated. They didn't know what had just happened, but they could see it in Bumpy's eyes. The game was over. Vinny dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands flying to his neck, trying to stop the poison from taking over. His face turned red, then blue, his chest heaving as the toxin did its work. Bumpy stepped back, watching it all unfold like a man who'd already seen the end of the story. He wasn't here to kill. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to send a message. "You tried to take me down," Bumpy said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't understand. I don't play the game like you. You tried to hit my wife, tried to break me, but you didn't know I don't break, and I don't forget." Vinny was choking now, his face contorted in agony. His men didn't move. They just stood there, paralyzed with fear. They didn't know whether to help their boss or watch as he died in front of them. "Get the doctor," one of the men muttered, his voice shaking. Bumpy didn't even flinch. He didn't wait. He just looked at Vinny, watching the man struggle for air. "You messed with the wrong family, Vinny, and now you'll learn what happens when you do." The soldiers started to panic, rushing to Vinny's side, but Bumpy was already turning away. He didn't need to see the rest. He knew what was coming. And as he walked out the door of Vitali's, leaving a room full of men paralyzed with fear, one thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't over. The streets of Harlem seemed quieter now, as if the city itself was holding its breath after the storm that had just passed. But Bumpy, he wasn't stopping. He wasn't breathing easy. Not yet. There was still work to do. The pieces on the board had shifted, but the game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Cadillac rumbled down the road, its engine humming like a predator in the dark. Zip was beside him, eyes fixed ahead, hands steady on his lap. They didn't need words right now. The tension was thick in the air, but neither man was ready to speak. They both knew the next step. Vinny Falcone might be done, but the Italians, they weren't finished yet. And there was something else, something bigger. Bumpy could feel it. It was in the air. Someone was making a move, and Bumpy had to be ready. He always had to be ready. The city flashed by, streetlights flickering as they passed. Harlem was waking up, and so was Bumpy. His mind was already working, piecing together the next steps in his plan. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was controlling it all, moving in ways his enemies couldn't even see yet. They thought they had the game figured out, but they didn't know Bumpy. They didn't know the lengths he would go to protect what was his. Bumpy's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence between him and Zip. He pulled it out, eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from his inside man. "The catering company. They're on the move," it read. Bumpy's brow furrowed as he read the words. The catering company. They were just the foot soldiers, the ones who had sent Johnny Hooks to do the job. But now it seemed like they were making their own play. Maybe they thought they could slip under the radar. Maybe they thought Bumpy wouldn't notice, but they didn't know him. They didn't know how his eyes were always watching, always calculating. "Zip," Bumpy said, his voice calm but filled with intent. "We're not done yet. We need to pay the catering company a visit." Zip nodded, his face hardening. "Got it. You want them in one piece, or should we break M first? Bumpy's lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile you wanted to see on a man like him. Let's just say, it depends on how cooperative they are. The car slid into the shadows of a back alley, the kind of place that screamed desperation. The catering company's office was tucked between two rundown buildings, an unassuming storefront with a sign that looked like it had been slapped up in a hurry. The windows were dark, the lights inside flickering faintly, giving the place an eerie, almost abandoned feel. Bumpy didn't wait. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with that familiar rhythm, the sound of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Zip was close behind, his presence silent but heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The door to the catering office was locked. Bumpy didn't knock. He didn't need to. With one swift kick, the door splintered open, the hinges giving way with a loud crack. Inside, the office was empty, save for a couple of file cabinets and a few dusty tables. "Where's the owner?" Bumpy asked, his voice cold, unwavering. A man in a cheap suit popped out from behind a corner, his face pale with fear. What do you want?" He stammered, his hands trembling. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't need to say anything. He just stepped closer, his shadow falling over the man like a dark cloud. "I'm here for the truth," Bumpy said softly. "And you're going to give it to me." The man looked around as if hoping for some kind of escape, but he knew it was useless. Bumpy was the last person you wanted to be on the wrong side of. "Who hired you?" Bumpy pressed, his tone even, but there was an edge to it now. "Who's pulling the strings?" The man gulped, his eyes darting between Bumpy and Zip. It was Vinny. "He paid me to hire the waiter." He cut himself off, the words sticking in his throat. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "To what?" "To take her out," the man whispered. "Vinny said it would break you, that you'd be too distracted, too weak to fight back. He wanted to take the whole racket, the numbers, the streets, everything." Bumpy stood still for a long moment, letting the words sink in. Vinny had underestimated him, again. But this time it wasn't just about money or power. This was personal. "You're going to clean up your mess," Bumpy said, his voice low and controlled. "You're going to tell me everything I need to know, and then you're going to disappear, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man nodded frantically, his fear now palpable. "I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt me." Bumpy stepped closer, his presence closing in on the man like a vice. "You've got one chance to make this right. Don't waste it." The man's eyes darted to the files on the table, then back to Bumpy. He started talking, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. Bumpy listened, his mind racing through the new information. The players were coming together now. Vinny was just the tip of the iceberg. There were others, people Bumpy hadn't even considered yet, people who were waiting to make their move. But Bumpy wasn't worried. He was always a step ahead. "Good," Bumpy said when the man finished. "You're going to make sure this goes away. You're going to bury it." The man nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I will. I'll make sure of it." Bumpy looked at Zip, who nodded once, signaling the end of their conversation. "I want this clean. No more messes," Bumpy said. "You're going to disappear, and if I hear one more whisper about this, well, you'll wish I'd killed you." Without another word, Bumpy turned and walked out of the office, Zip following close behind. The city didn't know it yet, but Harlem was about to change again. And Bumpy, he was the one who would decide who stayed and who went. The city of Harlem slept, but Bumpy didn't. He never did. There was always something in the air, always a game being played in the shadows, and Bumpy had to keep his eyes sharp. The Italians were scattered, broken for now. The message was loud and clear. But the war, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The car rolled through the streets like a ghost, a shadow on the asphalt. The headlights sliced through the darkness, cutting a path through the veins of the city. Bumpy sat in the backseat, staring out the window, his mind running a mile a minute. His wife was still fighting, and he hadn't forgotten the reason why this had all started. Vinny Falcone might be out of the picture, but there was still work to be done. He turned to Zip, who was riding shotgun, his eyes constantly scanning the street, looking for any sign of trouble. "We got a problem," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady. Zip didn't look at him, just kept his eyes forward. "What's the word?" "The rats are scurrying," Bumpy replied, his voice sharp like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "I don't trust them. The Italians, the sharks, they're waiting for a crack, and we can't afford to give them one." Zip's jaw tightened. "What do you want to do?" Bumpy leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowed in thought. The world was a chessboard and he was the king. But every king needed a move, and Bumpy's next move had to be perfect. His empire wasn't just built on muscle, it was built on control. It was built on respect. And anyone who tried to take that from him, well, they'd see exactly what happened when you tried to steal from the king. "We go to the source," Bumpy said finally, his voice cutting through the silence of the car. "We make sure no one else tries to step into this world. No one gets the chance to rebuild." Zip nodded, understanding exactly what Bumpy meant. It was time to put the fear of God into anyone who thought they could take what was his. There was no room for mercy. The car pulled up outside an old warehouse in the heart of the Bronx. The kind of place that looked like it had seen better days, rusted metal, cracked windows, and graffiti smeared across the walls. But it was the perfect spot to make sure no one was going to move without Bumpy's say-so. Bumpy stepped out, his coat swinging behind him as he moved with purpose. Zip was right behind him, the two men walking into the darkness like they owned it. The warehouse was quiet, but Bumpy knew better than to think that meant it was safe. No place was safe when you had enemies lurking in the corners. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The air smelled of oil and stale cigarettes. A small group of men stood huddled together, their eyes shifting nervously as Bumpy and Zip walked in. "Boss," one of the men said, his voice shaking just enough for Bumpy to hear. We didn't think you'd be coming by." Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't need to. He didn't have to do anything but stand there, and the fear in the room would be enough to control it all. The men didn't move, but their eyes followed Bumpy like they were already anticipating the hammer coming down. "I've been hearing things," Bumpy said, his voice smooth, calm, but deadly. "Things I don't like. People talking, people thinking they can make a move without asking me first." The men shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was coming, but they didn't know how bad it was going to get. They were about to find out. "I don't like people stepping out of line," Bumpy continued, his tone a sharp contrast to the calmness of his words. "You see, you all work for me. You don't make moves without checking in. And when you screw up, you pay the price." The room fell silent, each man feeling the weight of Bumpy's words like a heavy chain around their neck. They all knew what happened when Bumpy Johnson decided someone needed to be put back in their place. "You've got one chance to fix this," Bumpy said, his eyes scanning the room. "You can either keep your heads down and do things my way, or you can get out of my city." The men looked at each other, fear and uncertainty in their eyes, but they knew better than to challenge Bumpy. They'd seen what happened to men who made that mistake. They'd seen Bumpy's power, seen the way he controlled everything with a calmness that was terrifying. "Understood?" Bumpy asked, his gaze now cold, unyielding. The men nodded quickly, all of them speaking at once. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, we understand. We won't make that mistake again." Bumpy gave them one last look, his expression unchanged. "Good. Now get out of here, and remember who runs this city." As they scattered, Bumpy turned to Zip, his expression still hard, still calculating. They were still in the game, still holding all the cards, but Bumpy knew this wasn't over. There were still players in the shadows, still people who thought they could take what was his. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next few hours felt like a slow burn. Harlem had settled back into its familiar rhythm, cars honking, people talking, the occasional siren wailing in the distance, but Bumpy knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The Italians were still licking their wounds. Vinnie Falcone's fall had shaken the family, but it hadn't destroyed it. Bumpy wasn't just a king because he was ruthless. He was a king because he understood how to break his enemies without them even knowing they'd been broken. He sat in the back of the Cadillac, eyes scanning the dark streets. Harlem felt different tonight, quieter, like the air was waiting for something. Maybe it was waiting for him to make his next move. And Bumpy, he wasn't going to leave anyone guessing. The car made a sharp turn into a dimly lit alleyway. They weren't far from the docks now, a part of the city Bumpy knew all too well. He could practically hear the whispers from the shadows. People who thought they were untouchable, people who thought they could stay hidden. But no one was untouchable, not while Bumpy was around. The car came to a stop in front of an old building, the type that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. Bumpy didn't waste any time. He stepped out of the car, his coat billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Zip followed close, his hands resting on the guns at his waist. There was no question where this was going. They walked into the building like they owned it, because in many ways they did. Inside, the room was lit by flickering fluorescent lights, casting long shadows across the walls. A group of men stood around a table, their faces tense, their eyes shifting as Bumpy entered. They were expecting someone. They didn't know who, but they knew they weren't going to like it. One of the men stood up as Bumpy walked in. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice thick with fear, "we weren't expecting you." Bumpy didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way he held himself, the weight of his presence, said it all. He moved forward slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the men standing in the room. "You've got a problem," Bumpy said softly, his voice smooth but dangerous. "And I don't like problems, especially not when they involve me." The man swallowed hard. "Mr. Johnson, we've been trying to fix things, we thought." "You thought?" Bumpy interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You thought you could run things behind my back. You thought you could make moves without telling me, without asking." The man's eyes darted to the others in the room, his gaze pleading for help, but there was nothing. No one was going to save him. Bumpy wasn't a man you bargained with. You either worked for him or you didn't work at all. "I told you," Bumpy said, his voice colder now, "there's no room for mistakes in my world. And when you make a mistake, you pay the price." The man took a step back, his face pale. "We didn't mean." Bumpy took a step forward, cutting him off. "I don't care what you meant. You crossed a line and now you're gonna pay for it." The room fell silent. The air felt thick, like it was waiting for something to snap. The men in the room looked between each other, each one unsure of what was coming next, but they knew. They'd heard the stories, they'd seen the bodies, and they knew Bumpy Johnson was a man who didn't waste time. "Get rid of them," Bumpy said to Zip, his voice calm but final. Zip didn't need to ask questions. He moved like a shadow, quick and efficient. The men didn't even have time to react before Zip had them pinned, their fates sealed in the cold silence of the room. There were no screams, no last words, just the sound of finality. Bumpy stood still, watching, his expression unwavering. He wasn't a man who reveled in violence. He didn't need to, but he knew when it was necessary, and tonight it was necessary. Once Zip finished, the room was still again. The air felt lighter, as if a storm had passed through and left nothing in its wake. Bumpy turned, his coat trailing behind him as he walked out of the building. Zip followed, his presence just as silent, just as lethal. The Cadillac was waiting for them, the engine purring softly as they climbed in. Bumpy leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping against the armrest, thinking. The game was far from over. There were more moves to be made, more pieces to fall into place. But tonight was a reminder that Bumpy Johnson was the one who controlled this city. Not the Italians, not the politicians, not the low-level punks who thought they could make a name for themselves. Only him. The car pulled away, the city's lights blinking in the distance like stars. Bumpy looked out the window, a slight smile tugging at his lips. He had sent a message. And Harlem was his kingdom. No one would forget that, but Bumpy wasn't finished yet. He had a bigger plan in mind. One that would shake the entire city. And when he was done, they'd all know, you don't mess with the king. The streets of Harlem seemed to hum with a quiet intensity, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Bumpy sat in the backseat of the Cadillac, his eyes narrowed, his mind still running at full speed. He had already made his mark. The message was loud and clear. But there was something gnawing at him, a feeling that told him the real work hadn't even begun. The Italians might be licking their wounds, but the war was just starting. There were bigger players in the shadows, and Bumpy could feel their eyes on him. The sound of the city was like a heartbeat, constant, relentless, and alive with movement. Bumpy had lived through it all. He knew how to survive in a world where loyalty was bought with blood, where respect was earned with power. But tonight something had changed. He could feel it deep in his bones. "Zip," Bumpy said, his voice low, controlled. "We're going to need a meeting." Zip, ever the shadow, didn't respond right away. He just kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hand steady on the wheel. He knew Bumpy didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The car turned down a narrow street, slowing as it approached a dimly lit building. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another rundown storefront in the middle of Harlem. But Bumpy knew better. This was the kind of place where deals were made in the shadows, where power changed hands without anyone noticing. They parked a few feet away, the car idling softly as Bumpy and Zip stepped out. The air was thick with tension, the smell of the city's nightlife heavy in the air. The building loomed in front of them, its windows dark, the door unmarked. It looked like a ghost in the dark, just another forgotten place in a city that had long since stopped caring about what was buried in its heart. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, the floor creaking underfoot as Bumpy and Zip walked into the back room. A small group of men sat around a table, their faces a mix of tension and respect. They knew what Bumpy represented. They knew the weight he carried, the power that followed him like a shadow. Bumpy didn't sit. He didn't need to. He just stood there looking at the men who were waiting for him. They were silent, but their eyes were sharp, calculating. They knew why they were here. They knew what was at stake. "We've got a problem," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And I need to know who's behind it." One of the men spoke up, his voice shaky. "Mr. Johnson, we've been keeping our eyes on things. The Italians are making moves. Vinny's fall hasn't stopped them. They're still looking to take control." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "I already took care of Vinny. What's the next move?" The man shifted in his seat, clearly nervous. "They're working with someone new, a player from out of town, someone who's been making waves in the underworld. Word is, he's been buying up territory, moving in on the numbers game." Bumpy's gaze hardened. "Who?" The man hesitated. "His name's Russo, Donnie Russo. He's been moving fast, too fast, and the word on the street is that he's looking to challenge you." Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't show any sign of surprise. He just stood there, his mind already calculating. Russo. The name didn't ring a bell, but that didn't matter. It would soon enough. No one moved into Bumpy's world without learning the hard way that they weren't welcome. "Russ looking to play," Bumpy said slowly, his eyes fixed on the men around him. "He thinks he can take what's mine. He's gonna learn the hard way." Zip stepped forward, his eyes cold. "What do you want us to do?" Bumpy looked around the room, his expression unreadable. "We make sure Russo knows who runs this city. We send him a message, and when he gets it, we make sure he understands that he's not welcome." One of the men shifted uncomfortably, looking at the others in the room. "How do you want to handle it, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy's eyes flicked toward him, his voice as cold as ice. "I want it clean. I don't want any messes, just like Vinny. We don't leave anything to chance." The men nodded, understanding the gravity of Bumpy's words. This wasn't about sending a message. This was about sending a warning. A warning that Bumpy Johnson didn't play games. A warning that whoever thought they could challenge him would pay the price. Bumpy turned to Zip. "Get the word out. Make sure everyone knows. Russo's time is up." Zip nodded, his eyes flashing with understanding. "On it." The room fell silent again, the weight of Bumpy's words settling over them like a storm cloud. There was no room for doubt in Bumpy's world. There was no second guessing. The only thing that mattered was power. And Bumpy was the one who controlled it all. As Bumpy walked out of the building, the cold night air hit him again. The city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of streets and alleys, but it was all his, every inch of it. No one could take that from him, not Russo, not the Italians. No one. Tonight the message would go out. Tomorrow there would be new players. But Bumpy would always be the one pulling the strings, always the one who sat at the top, and when they tried to challenge him, they'd learn the hard way. The Cadillac pulled away, the tires screeching as it moved through the streets. Bumpy stared out the window, his mind already on the next move. This war was far from over, and Bumpy Johnson was just getting started. The night pressed on, thick with uncertainty and the promise of conflict. Harlem was alive with its usual pulse, but Bumpy didn't feel it. He was too focused, too locked into the world spinning around him. The pieces were moving faster now, shifting with every word, every decision. But Bumpy had his eyes on the prize, and the prize was power, his power. And no one was going to take it from him. His Cadillac roared through the streets, a silent predator cutting through the chaos of the city. Zip sat next to him, quiet as always, the only sound the steady rhythm of the tires hitting the pavement. They both knew where they were headed, Russo's operation. Bumpy had already made up his mind. The time for subtlety was over. It was time to show this Russo who really ran the streets of Harlem. The car came to a slow stop in front of an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, worn down, like so many other places in Harlem that had been left to rot. But Bumpy knew better. He could smell the danger here, feel the tension in the air. This was where it all started. This was where Russo was building his empire. But tonight, it would be his downfall. Bumpy stepped out of the car, his coat billowing behind him like the storm that was about to break. Zip followed close behind, his hand resting on the gun at his waist. The night air was cool, but Bumpy felt none of it. He was a man of purpose, and the only thing on his mind was sending a message. A message that would make Russo and anyone else who thought they could challenge him regret it. They moved into the warehouse with the quiet precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. The shadows stretched long, covering them as they slipped through the darkened hallways. The smell of old wood and rust filled the air, but Bumpy didn't notice. He had his eyes locked on the goal, Russo. At the far end of the warehouse, Bumpy could hear voices, men talking, laughing, the faint sound of music playing in the background. He didn't need to ask who it was. He knew. Russo and his crew. It was time to remind them that no one took what was Bumpy's. They approached the door and Bumpy signaled Zip to stop. He listened for a moment, his ears straining to catch the conversation inside. His eyes flicked toward the door, and without a word he stepped forward, his hand pushing it open with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside, the men froze. Russo's eyes locked onto Bumpy's the moment he entered. The man looked like he'd been expecting someone, but not Bumpy. Not like this. His face paled and his hand went instinctively to his side where a gun sat, but he didn't draw it. He didn't need to. Bumpy had already won. "I thought I told you to stay out of my city," Bumpy said, his voice low, steady. "But it seems you didn't get the message." Russo's hand dropped from his side, his face tight with fear. The men around him shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. They had heard the stories. They knew what happened when Bumpy came calling. And they knew it wasn't going to be pretty. "I didn't mean any disrespect, Mr. Johnson," Russo said, his voice shaky. "We're just doing business. We weren't trying to step on your toes." Bumpy didn't respond right away. He just stood there watching Russo like a lion watching prey. His gaze was cold, calculating. He knew the game. He had always known the game. "You don't get it, do you?" Bumpy said, taking a step closer, his presence overpowering. "This isn't about business. This is about loyalty, and you don't have it. You never did." The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Russo's men exchanged nervous glances, but no one moved. No one dared to. Bumpy's presence filled the room like a heavy fog, suffocating them all. Bumpy moved toward Russo, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "You thought you could come into Harlem and take what was mine," he said softly. "But I don't share, Russo. Not with anyone." Russo opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He knew he was done. He knew this was the end. "I don't need you in my city," Bumpy continued. "I don't need you or anyone else thinking they can take what I've built. You're gonna leave, Russo, and if I ever hear your name in Harlem again, it'll be the last time anyone does." Without another word, Bumpy turned and walked out of the warehouse. The men inside were paralyzed with fear, but none of them dared to move. They all knew what had just happened. They all knew that Bumpy Johnson was the one who controlled everything in Harlem. Zip followed him out without a word. The night air hit them again as they stepped into the Cadillac. Bumpy's eyes were fixed forward, his mind already moving, already thinking ahead. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "Russell's out," Zip said, glancing at Bumpy. "But there's still work to be done." Bumpy nodded, his expression cold, his mind focused. "We keep moving," he said. "We make sure no one forgets who runs this city, not the Italians, not anyone." The Cadillac rolled away, disappearing into the night, and Harlem streets fell silent once more. But everyone knew Bumpy Johnson was the king, and no one, not Russo, not the Italians, not anyone, could take that from him. The city of Harlem settled into its familiar rhythm once more, but for Bumpy, it would never be the same. His war with the Italians, with Russo, with anyone who thought they could take his throne, had ended. But the echo of that battle, of the blood spilled and the power seized, lingered in the air. Harlem would never forget the day Bumpy Johnson reminded them who controlled the streets. Bumpy sat in his office now, the same office he'd built from nothing, the same one he'd sat in for years as king of the city. The room was quiet, the only sound the steady hum of the old fan in the corner. But Bumpy wasn't listening to the fan. He was thinking about everything that had led him here, everything he had fought for. His empire wasn't built on violence alone. It wasn't built on fear. It was built on something deeper. It was built on respect. And that respect, it was unshakable. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass. It was smooth, like victory, like control. He took a sip, savoring the taste, his thoughts drifting back to the chaos of the last few days, the messages he'd sent, the moves he'd made, the people who thought they could step into his world and take what was his. But Bumpy Johnson didn't share, not with anyone. He set the glass down on the desk and leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming softly on the wood. Harlem was quiet tonight. Too quiet, but that was the way Bumpy liked it. The calm before the storm, the peace before the next battle, and there would always be another battle, another challenge to overcome. But for now it was over. The Italians were out. Russo was finished. Anyone who thought they could take his place had learned the hard way. Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be challenged. The door to the office opened softly and Zip stepped in, his face unreadable, his presence as solid as ever. "Everything's quiet, boss," Zip said, his voice steady as always. "The streets are calm, for now." Bumpy nodded, his eyes focused on the empty glass in front of him. "It won't stay that way," he said quietly. "It never does." Zip didn't reply, but Bumpy didn't need him to. They both understood the game. The streets would never truly be calm, not when you were at the top, but Bumpy had already made his mark. Harlem was his kingdom and no one was going to take it from him. "You got word on the others?" Bumpy asked, his voice low, calculating. Zip paused for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm sure there's more coming." Bumpy stood up, his gaze locked on the city outside the window. He could see the lights of Harlem flickering in the distance, the pulse of the city alive with possibility. But Bumpy wasn't interested in the lights. He was interested in the power behind them. He was interested in the chessboard, the game that never stopped, the moves that never ended. "Let them come," Bumpy said softly, his voice firm, unwavering. "Let them try, but they'll never take what's mine." He turned back to Zip, his eyes cold with resolve. "You know what we need to do. We keep moving, we keep watching, and when the time comes, we'll make our move. Again." Zip nodded, his face unreadable, but his eyes showed understanding. "Right, boss." Bumpy smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver through the room. "And when we make our move, there won't be anyone left to challenge us." The game was always moving, always changing, always evolving. But one thing was certain, Bumpy Johnson would always be the one pulling the strings. He'd always be the king of Harlem. No one else would ever take his crown. As Bumpy turned back to the window, his gaze drifting over the city, he felt the weight of everything he had built. And he knew Harlem was his now and forever. The streets were quiet for now, but the storm was coming. And when it did, Bumpy would be waiting. Because no one could stop him. No one could stop the king.